everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm so happy you're here. My name is Marianne, and on this channel I talk about geopolitical challenges. And today I want to review what happened in 2025. I believe that 2025 will be remembered as a year when multiple geopolitical fault lines shifted at once, reinforcing each other, amplifying instability, and eroding the assumptions that had governed international politics since the end of the Cold War and even World War II. Great powers did not merely compete in 2025, they tested limits, legal, institutional, and strategic. From Washington to Kiev, from Gaza to East Asia, the rules that once constrained power continued to be bent, ignored, or openly challenged. What emerged was not a new order, but a more volatile one. Donald Trump's return to the White House marked more than a political comeback. It marked a structural shift in how U.S.'s power is exercised. Domestically, the first year of the second mandate was defined by pressure on the rule of law and judicial independence, open conflict with federal agencies, the politicization of immigration enforcement, with ICE empowered in unprecedented ways, renewed controversies surrounding executive secrecy and unresolved scandals from Trump's first presidency and before. And geopolitically, it was consequential. Trump's foreign policy in 2025 was characterized by abrupt policy swings, transactional diplomacy, and a renewed tariff war framed as economic nationalism. China was once again treated primarily as a trade adversary rather than a strategic rival to be managed. Europe found itself under pressure economically, politically, and within NATO as US commitments became openly conditional. South Africa and Brazil were singled out over trade alignment and governance issues, exposing the fragility of global South-US relations. And at the same time, Trump softened his posture towards Russia. The rhetoric towards Vladimir Putin shifted from confrontation to accommodation, unsettling NATO allies already questioning the reliability of American security guarantees. And the result is not isolationism only, but unpredictability, a far more destabilizing force. By 2025, the Ukraine war entered its fourth year. Trump pushed aggressively for a peace deal, framing the conflict as costly, endless, and solvable through negotiation. But the reality on the ground resisted quick solutions. Russia's economy became the question mark. There are signs of a weakening economy, but it still also seemed to resist sanctions. Through its wartime economy, it sustained employment. Energy exports continued through alternative channels, and the states absorbed economic inefficiencies in exchange for strategic endurance. Ukraine, meanwhile, faced a different challenge, a grinding war of attrition, mounting fatigue amongst allies, which also are facing economic difficulties, and growing domestic scandals involving procurement, reconstruction funds, and corruption. The war did not decisively shift on the ground in 2025, but politically it did. What was once being framed as a clear moral struggle was increasingly contested by the Trump administration and is now testing Western resolve more than ever. And on this front, Donald Trump's attempts at a peace negotiation have failed, not taking into account the reality of and the gap between Russia's demands and the possible Ukraine concessions for a long and durable peace. But nowhere in 2025 was human suffering more visible than in the Middle East. Gaza experienced a near total destruction, civilian infrastructure collapsed, and humanitarian conditions deteriorated beyond previous thresholds. Israel continued its military campaign, prioritizing security dominance over diplomatic restraint, Trump proposed an unconventional and widely criticized plan for Gaza's future.
The core points of the peace plan for Gaza included an immediate ceasefire and the release of the hostages and some prisoners from Palestine. And in a second phase, demilitarization and securizing of the area. And finally, a phase to establish a transitional government body under international supervision and to begin the long-term reconstruction and development of Gaza into a so-called de-radicalized terror-free zone focused on civilian benefits. As of the end of this year, this Gaza plan has achieved limited but tangible progress. An internationally mediated ceasefire has been partially implemented. Several rounds of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners have been exchanged, and humanitarian aid flows into Gaza have resumed, albeit inconsistently and below agreed targets. However, the other phases of the plan remain largely stalled, including the deployment of an international stabilization force, Israeli withdrawal, the establishment of a transitional Palestinian governance authority, and large-scale reconstruction. Israeli security concerns about withdrawal and unresolved disputes over post-war governments have prevented the transition from short-term de-escalation to durable political and security arrangements.
Meanwhile, Iran maintains strategic ambiguity, avoiding direct war while expanding influence through proxies.
And one of those proxy is the Hezbollah, which
the Hezbollah remained a constant escalation risk in Lebanon, and Yemen continued to absorb regional power struggle with devastating human costs. To be noted, though, in Yemen, the Houthis have stopped their attacks on ships that go through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea after the signature of the peace deal for Gaza.
In Sudan, the civil war in 2025 continued at high intensity. Estimates indicated tens of thousands killed since 2023 and over 14 million people displaced internally and as refugees, making it one of the largest displacement crises globally. In South Sudan, renewed fighting and political repression during 2025 caused hundreds to thousands of deaths and forced roughly 400,000 to 500,000 people to flee their homes that year alone, on top of a long-standing displacement. Taken together, these conflicts left well over 15 million people displaced across both countries and exposed millions more to severe food insecurity, diseases, and the collapse of basic services, illustrating the extraordinary human scale of the crisis. Additionally, an escalating war of words between Ethiopia and Eritrea is triggering fears of conflict. The region saw more coups this year, first with Guinea-Bissau by the military, and in Madagascar what started as a youth protest forced the president out of the country, but the army took over. Finally, security has deteriorated under each of the military juntas that seized power in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. In Mali, blockades of key transportation arteries in the west and south by the local Islamist terrorist group have caused fuel and other shortages in Bamako, exposing the junta's inability to provide security as well as its lack of legitimacy.
Meanwhile, in East Asia, this year marked a sharp rise in strategic anxiety. A controversial statement by Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, interpreted as a firmer stance against Chinese coercion, triggered a major diplomatic backlash by Beijing. Behind the scene, Beijing intensified efforts to shape
Japanese politics,
seeking to block leadership perceived as confrontational, and especially the election of Sanae Takaichi.
Being accused of trying to prevent the election of Sanae Takaichi as prime minister.
The response was the opposite of what China intended. Japan accelerated defense spending, strategic alignment with regional partners, and public discussion of deterrence once considered taboo. Across the region, fear spread faster than ideology. An arms race that has been ongoing for years is quietly gaining momentum, and China, meanwhile, is increasing its military presence through naval and air exercises around Taiwan and demonstrations of force designed to normalize pressure rather than provoke war.
A brief armed conflict between India and Pakistan began on May 7th, 2025, after India launched missile strikes on Pakistan.
Pushed by Trump again, in 2025, the US and Venezuela relations entered a gray zone, neither war or peace, and neither law or diplomacy. Washington intensified pressures on Caracas through sanction enforcement, covert cooperation with regional actors, legal and economic maneuvers that bypassed traditional multilateral frameworks. But most shockingly, the extraterritorial killing of suspected drug traffickers at sea. And the justification for all this was familiar: security, immigration, crime, drug trafficking, and regional stability. But the methods raised serious questions and reinforced the perception that rules apply selectively. Venezuela became another test for the broader trend of a world where great powers increasingly act first and justify later, and feel emboldened to act as they want. The long-term risk is not regional instability alone, but also the erosion of international rule of law itself. Beyond these headlines, there are several strategic developments that shape 2025 just as profoundly. In 2025, the global economic fragmentation has accelerated. The economic de-risking has effectively crossed into selective decoupling. Trade weaponization through tariff, export controls, subsidies have become normalized. Supply chains increasingly reorganized along geopolitical blocks. WTO dispute mechanisms continued to lose relevance, and middle powers were forced into alignment choices they had previously avoided. This matters because it underpins US-China tensions, it shapes Europe's strategic anxiety, and amplifies the global South resentment towards Western rules. 2025 further exposed the hollowing out of international institutions. The UN Security Council paralysis became permanent rather than episodic. International law was invoked rhetorically but ignored operationally, especially when it mattered. The enforcement mechanisms proved toothless without great power consent. And in the security field, AI and cyber power were quietly reshaping deterrence, while taking over a lot of headlines in the economic field. So we saw the integration of AI into intelligence analysis, targeting, and logistics. We also saw expanded cyber operations below the threshold of armed conflict, but constituting hybrid attacks. But we also see that there is no binding global rules on military AI development. This could lower the cost for disruption and espionage between rival states. It also increases miscalculation risks and favors ambiguity over accountability. Cyber attacks are hard to attribute, allowing deniability by the attacking state. Climate change continues to show that it can strongly impact human security. It is a conflict accelerator, and in 2025, there was a record-breaking heat, making it the second or third warmest year, including a brutal India-Pakistan heat wave peaking at 48 degrees Celsius in India. And globally, July 2025 was the third warmest July on record. And finally, perhaps the most unsettling trend of 2025 was not only the authoritarian assertiveness, but also the democratic adaptation to it. We saw democratic governments increasingly using emergency powers, especially in the US, justifying ICE raids and tariffs through national emergency, but also in several European states that expanded emergency-style executive powers related to border control, migration, and counterterrorism, often renewing temporary measures year after year. Protests were restricted and civil liberties framed as strategic liabilities. Pro-Palestinian demonstrations, for example, citing public order, anti-Semitism concerns, and foreign influence. In Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and India, authorities limited protest locations and timing on issues involving China, alliance, or national defense. They were justified by national security, public order, foreign influence, counter-infiltration, and protection against hybrid warfare. And there is also still this push for immigration enforcement, policies that blur civil and military roles. So there seems to be a shift in what states consider as acceptable behavior internally and externally. So as a conclusion, taken individually, these developments are not unprecedented, but taken together, they marked a turning point, and especially with the new US administration, 2025 exposed a world where power is less restrained by law, alliances are more conditional, and stability depends increasingly on deterrence rather than trust. 2025 was not defined only by a visible crisis, but a deeper structural shift. Economic blocs hardened, global institutions lost authority, digital and climate pressures accelerated crisis, and even democracies normalized exceptional powers in the name of security. The result is a world where rules matter less, ambiguity matters more, and power increasingly fills the gaps left by the law and governments. This is not yet the collapse of the international order, but it explains why the world feels fundamentally less stable. So on this not very positive note, I thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I wish you a very good new year and start of 2026. Thank you for watching. Bye.